Right, I think I've been given the signal to start, is that correct? Good. So, welcome everyone. I'm Rainer Schulze, the director of the Human Rights Center, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you last end of the academic year and still coming to these events. This evening's lecture marks two separate and yet two very closely related events. On the one hand, this is the beginning of the formal cooperation and collaboration between the International Center on Human Rights and Drug Policy on the one hand, and the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex on the other. And we are also launching the first joint project, the Human Rights and Drug Policy Debate Series, which is led by the ICHRDP and is based in the School of Law. The International Center on Human Rights and Drug Policy was only set up in 2009, but in this short period, it has already developed an excellent reputation for its innovative and cutting-edge work in legal and human rights research and teaching on issues related to drug laws, policy, and enforcement. You will have seen the journal which the ICHRDP is publishing, the only peer-reviewed human rights journal specifically focusing on drug issues. And through its work, the ICHRDP, this doesn't come easily, you need to change that. Supports policy development which reconciles or aims to reconcile the International Narcotics Control Conventions with international human rights law. The Essex Human Rights Center is delighted to be associated with the ICHRDP. I believe we share the same philosophy of linking very closely high-quality research with both teaching and practice. And I can see quite a number of areas where we can develop new initiatives together and where partnership and cooperation will be to the benefit of both of us. This includes basically all areas of our work as far as I can see. I can see us developing joint multidisciplinary research projects which can potentially involve the wide range of academics across the whole of the university who engage in human rights work, not only law, but also sociology, health and human sciences, the Essex Business School, and more. I can also see us including units on human rights, drugs law, drug policy, drug enforcement in our human rights programs here at Essex as essential parts of our various spines in our MA and BA degrees. And I can see us developing CPDs and other training programs for practitioners that we can put on together both here and London and elsewhere. So I would argue the potential for both sides of an emerging partnership, and I hope that we will be able to sign a partnership very shortly, that the potential of such a partnership is immense. And I hope I'm not being too ambitious here, but given time, I think we can actually do something rather quite new and innovative together. The first example of our cooperation is the project that Noam will introduce very briefly in a moment. But before handing over to Noam, let me just say that I regard this project as only the first of many that will follow, the first step in the development of a fruitful and mutually beneficial relationship between the Essex Human Rights Center and the International Center for Human Rights and Drug Policy. So I hope this marks the beginning of a long relationship. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone, and I know what a busy time this is. I do think, hopefully, you'll find this, well, I'm sure you'll find it interesting. I think you'll find it actually relevant to a lot of the things that some of you are preparing for now in your various exams that you're getting ready for. And papers and so on. I just want to say on a personal note that it's actually quite special to see how quickly we got this off the ground, because this all started, this whole idea of a partnership and this project. I think we were 4 of us sitting in a lobby in a hotel in China about, how long was it? When was it, Nancy? Less, much less, I think. Less than a year, yeah. But yeah, not that long ago when we were thinking this is a great idea to form a partnership with Essex and we can start doing some projects, and we've managed to do that, so that's wonderful. We're actually launching a few things now. There's, as Rainer mentioned, there's the discussions of formal collaboration between the centres. There's also the project. There's also 2 publications, and one of them is the commentary on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child with regard to protection from narcotic drugs. And Damon, I think, your talk's going to be all about that, isn't it? Or a lot about
partly,
that?
Yeah.
Right, okay, so we're going to hear about that, but this is a new publication that's just come out, and we're happy to be launching it here. There's the journal, and I was supposed to take the pointer with me, right?
At the other side of it.
No, yes,
If you point to the right hand arrow, yeah.
that's done both.
Oh.
Right, anyway, it's supposed to be the journal, because what you're holding now in your hands is the first issue. The second issue has just been launched as well, so this is the first time that, right now in virtual format, but that's being seen, the second issue of this journal. And then there's the project. Now, this project that we're doing, which is housed in the School of Law, is essentially the creation of a series of debates around the world looking at human rights and drug policy. And it'll happen in universities. We're still working on the various places, but discussions are about doing this in Colombia, Indonesia, China, possibly South Africa, as well as sort of the obvious candidates. I think we're talking about doing one at, was it Yale, or I think, but around the world. And the topics that can be discussed, and you'll see this soon, that we're going to debate in these events range, and most people don't realize the wide range here when we talk about human rights and drug policy, but we're talking about mandatory death penalty for drug crimes. We're talking about ill treatment and abuse of drug users in detention. We're talking about wars, armed conflicts. I think Afghanistan, Colombia, the link to violence in Mexico, indigenous rights, Bolivia and coca growers, and obviously a host of issues related to right to health, access to palliative care and certain medicines and so on. So it's endless, really, and it spans almost everything that you'll have looked at in your studies so far this year. There is something there that links to issues of drug policy. And hopefully some of that will be coming out in the lectures you'll see today, but this really is a cutting-edge area of human rights, one in which there are not that many and clearly not enough people working on. And so if you're also still thinking of sort of more areas for various papers and dissertations, there's plenty, and have a chat with Rick or Damon afterwards. They can give you lots of ideas. All right, this is an exciting area, cutting-edge area, and we're going to hear a lot about that from our 2 speakers. So I'll hand over now to Paul, who's going to be chairing. And thanks again for being here.
Good evening, everybody. When I served as rapporteur on the right to the highest attainable standard of health, Rick and Damon, our 2 speakers tonight, were extremely supportive and discreetly educated me about some issues that I was unfamiliar with. I say discreetly because I really didn't know much, but they didn't make me feel embarrassed about my ignorance, but educated me, and I'm most grateful to them. And I'm really delighted that we have this new institutional collaboration. And can I very briefly but warmly thank everybody who is responsible for making this collaboration happen. I'm delighted to welcome Rick and Damon and introduce them this evening. Each will speak for about 20 minutes. I suggest we have both presentations and then take Q&A. So briefly, first of all, a word of introduction about Rick. Rick is co-founder of the International Center on Human Rights and Drug Policy. He's presently, poor man, Executive Director of Harm Reduction International. I say poor man because it's a tough job. It's a demanding job. And he's been working on HIV/AIDS, human rights and drug policy research and advocacy since before the flood, a long time ago, since the early 1990s. And he's very well known for his leading work in areas including HIV in prisons and the death penalty for drug offences. Rick has worked at a senior level for NGOs in Canada, Ireland, the UK, and is a member of the technical advisory group to the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, and also a member of the reference group to the United Nations on HIV and injecting drug use. And the title of Rick's presentation is Deliver Us from Evil, Drug Control, Human Rights and Parallel Universes. Many thanks, Rick.
Thank you. And thanks very much for all the warm welcome. Thank you to Rainer, and thank you to Noam and to Paul, all of whom have been very good friends of Damon and myself in the process of bringing the collaboration between our relatively new project and the Human Rights Center here at Essex. Also Paul, who's been a great friend of ours, as you said, well before Damon and I even founded this project, working together while Paul was the special rapporteur on issues related particularly to HIV and injecting drug use. And thanks to Noam for initially introducing this discussion of the possibility of partnership. And thanks to Nancy Prudhomme, our projects director, for helping to organize today. And especially thanks to all of you for joining us. Paul gave you the topic of my presentation. I'm going to be talking a bit more generally. I'm assuming that most people here are perhaps unfamiliar, would be an understatement, with the nature of international drug control law. So I'm going to try to give a bit of a historical overview and a contextual overview, and then I think Damon is going to take a particular area of drug control and dig down a bit deeper into some of the ways that human rights law engages issues of drug control. Now, see if I can make this work. Now, the man on the left is probably a familiar face. My left, your right, probably a familiar face to most of you. Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations. My guess is that the man standing next to him is probably less familiar to most of you. Does anyone know who that is? I wouldn't expect that you probably would, unless you were a drug control geek like us. His name is Hamid Godzi. He's the president of the International Narcotics Control Board, or the INCB. The International Narcotics Control Board is the treaty body, the United Nations treaty body, which is mandated to oversee the implementation of the 3 United Nations drug control conventions. So it's a parallel committee of independent experts, similar to the Human Rights Committee or the Committee on the Rights of the Child. But it sits specifically within the drug control regime. And just recently, this was in March, the INCB was the subject of a bit of controversy in relationship to this issue of human rights and drug control. One of the members of the board had been in Thailand releasing their annual report and was questioned by a reporter about whether the International Narcotics Control Board had a position on the death penalty for drugs. And the member of the board replied that the INCB had no position on the death penalty for drugs, which was quite unnerving because there actually is quite an established position of the United Nations as an entity, let alone the human rights regime within the United Nations, against the death penalty for drugs specifically, and of course the death penalty generally. Mr. Godzi was at a meeting of NGOs in March that Damon attended, There was a question raised about the death penalty. There was also a question raised about the board's annual report in regards to Vietnam. Vietnam is one of several countries in Asia and Southeast Asia that employs a process of mandatorily detaining people for drug use, arbitrary detention. About 50 to 100,000 people are detained specifically in Vietnam for periods of 2 or 3 years at a time. And a lot of the literature and the human rights monitoring of those camps have described them essentially as forced labor camps. The International Narcotics Control Board complimented Vietnam on their drug treatment regime and encouraged them to continue it. So there was a question from one of our NGO colleagues to Mr. Godzi at the NGO meeting, basically asking, in the context of these two issues, the death penalty and the arbitrary detention, is there actually no atrocity horrific enough that the International Narcotics Control Board would take a position on? To which Mr. Godzi replied, 100% no, because we don't actually see it as part of our mandate. We're not mandated to have an opinion. And of course, we're not really talking about matters of opinion here. We're talking about matters of international law. The International Narcotics Control Board is a forum within the regime of international law, but yet they're not really looking at broader international law. And it's quite interesting to us, I think, because when he says they don't express their opinion, they are quite open about expressing other opinions. So while he doesn't want to have an opinion on established areas of human rights law, such as the prohibition of torture and inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment, or the international safeguards on the use of capital punishment, he is quite happy to make up his own human rights. He likes to talk about the right to be free from drug addiction, which is what he talked about in the most recent report of the International Narcotics Control Board. I mean, this is sort of a serious yet, a bit humorous, I suppose, example of where we have this disconnect between human rights and drug policy at the international level. Within the UN system, I suppose the biggest event every year where we see this disconnect is on the date of June 26th. When you look at the United Nations calendar of events every year, June 26th is the International Day Against Drug Abuse and Illicit Trafficking. It's also, ironically, the International Day in the support of victims of torture. So we have this day that's being sort of celebrated or commemorated at the UN for both drug control efforts and a key human rights norm. Of course, the irony here is that China is quite notorious for using June 26th as the day to publicly execute drug offenders. And they tend to execute dozens and dozens of people publicly. And for people who are students of the death penalty or interested in the death penalty, you'll know that China is actually quite secretive about its use of capital punishment. And June 26th is one of the only days of the year when they're not very secretive about it and are quite proud of executing people in their celebration of International Narcotics Control Day. And it's not just China. Indonesia executed some people a couple of years ago as well. So this is an example of what Professor Hunt said in a speech several years ago about this parallel universe, this concept of the United Nations drug control regime and the human rights regime operating as if they exist in parallel universes. We've seen that the drug control regime very rarely looks at issues related to human rights. And on the flip side, the human rights regime within the UN has, until recently, not really been very interested in drug control issues. And between these sort of two stools, or these two parallel universes, to use Professor Hunt's words, we see significant areas of human rights concern. But this isn't actually a new phenomenon within the UN. This kind of idea of parallel universes is as old as the institution itself. Just over 65, 66 years ago, here in London, was the very first meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. And one of the very first issues that the new UN General Assembly had on their list of items to talk about was what to do about this man. I'm good with pictures today. Anyone recognize him? That's General Francisco Franco, who was the fascist leader of Spain. Franco had led a coup about 10 years prior against the democratically elected government of Spain, with large support from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, as well as a number of major US corporations, but that's sort of a different story for the time being, overthrew the democratically elected government and fought on the side of the Axis powers in World War II. After the end of World War II, Franco was really the only one of the major fascist leaders who remained in power. So as this new United Nations, this new international organization came together, one of the first things on the agenda was what to do about the organization's relationship to Spain, because governments didn't actually recognize Franco as a legitimate government. They recognized the Republican government that had been deposed. So the delegation of Panama proposed a resolution to the UN General Assembly, essentially that Franco's Spain be debarred from membership in the United Nations, and specifically banned from participating in any conferences or activities which may be arranged by the United Nations. And when you read the debates and the summary records of that meeting, wonderful speeches from pretty much all of the states represented about the need to not engage with Franco, how we don't recognize the government of Franco. We recognize, the rights of the Republican government that had been deposed. This resolution was passed almost unanimously. There were just a couple of Latin American states who opposed it. I suppose probably states that would have been sympathetic to Franco at the time. That's fine. We can see that's very much in keeping with the founding of the United Nations. 6 months later, in Lake Success, New York, we had the third meeting of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. And one of the things on the agenda of that meeting was that they struck a subcommittee to deal with the issue of narcotic drugs. Before the UN was founded, we had the League of Nations. There was half a dozen international drug control treaties agreed under the League of Nations. And one of the first things on the agenda of the Economic and Social Council was how do we bring this body, this existing body of treaty law on drugs, under the umbrella of the United Nations. And so they were debating or drafting a protocol in order to do that. And again, Franco was on the agenda. In this case, there was a resolution put forward jointly by the governments of the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and China, basically to say that in the context of drug control, we should not engage with Franco. We should respect the resolution that had been passed 6 months earlier in London at the General Assembly, debarring Franco's Spain from being involved with the UN activities. Therefore, we should not collaborate with them on drug control, and we should not invite fascist Spain to be a party to this new protocol that we're discussing. And despite the near unanimous opinion of the General Assembly, we have the parallel universes cropping up. We have the government of the United Kingdom arguing very strenuously against this, that we have to work with Franco when it comes to questions of drug control. Even though Republican Democrats are languishing in prisons in fascist Spain, if you use some of the debates from the General Assembly, we still have to work with Franco around drugs because we can't have Spain become a narco state. I mean, some of the language is very similar to modern language. My home country, Canada, also opposed this resolution. In the end, the resolution that the UN should not collaborate with Franco's Spain on drug control did pass. The UK was the only government that voted against it. 5 countries abstained, including Canada and Greece and France and Colombia, one other, I can't remember. But again, we get back to Professor Hunt's comments that we have governments in one body of the UN talking about human rights that speak in a certain language, and as soon as they move over and get into the forum talking about drugs, they talk a very different language. And I say this dates from the very foundation of the institution itself. So we move to the modern day, the United Nations drug control system. This is the United Nations headquarters in Vienna. Many of you may not know that there's a UN headquarters in Vienna. People are familiar with the one in New York, where the General Assembly with. You'd be familiar with the one in Geneva, where the human rights bodies sit, the World Health Organization sits. This is the one in Vienna, which is where the drug control regime sits, as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency. In addition to the International Narcotics Control Board, which I mentioned, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime is based in Vienna, which many of you have probably heard of, and also the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. The international drug control regime is underpinned in the modern era by 3 international conventions negotiated through the United Nations system. These conventions enjoy almost universal ratification at this point in time. The first one was agreed in 1961, and this was essentially the convention that brought together all of the existing League of Nations conventions under that, primarily dealing with plant-based narcotics, focusing primarily on cannabis, coca, and opium. The 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, again, extending international control to more, laboratory-based drugs. And the 1988 Convention, which expands and further codifies penal sanctions related to drug control. As I mentioned, the International Narcotics Control Board, which oversees these three treaties as the treaty body. We also have the political body, which is the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which meets in Vienna. I guess 52, 53 member states. This is the old room that they used to meet in. I like this picture. That person there, that's actually me speaking. You'll see the seat I'm sitting in is actually the designated NGO seat at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. We get one seat, and it's very near the door. Actually, if you move two seats to my right, you're actually basically in the toilets. So that's where the NGOs sit. And I like this picture because you'll notice if you're actually important in this meeting, you sit up there because that's actually where everyone's facing. So you have your little NGOs, and we share seats if we get the opportunity to speak, which isn't very often, to make a representation to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. Within the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, they have a separate meeting, which is called the Committee of the Whole, which is essentially where they negotiate line by line the resolutions that come before the committee. And this is a separate room. And in 2008, it was an interesting time, and Damon was part of this. A very leading member of the UK delegation at that point in time, where the very first human rights resolution ever proposed came for debate before the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and it caused all kinds of controversy. Not to pick on the Chinese delegation, but they had some of the best lines. Again, to talk about these parallel universes or this disconnect, China argued that discussion of political issues such as human rights are inappropriate at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. It's not appropriate to address human rights within the mission of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and it's ridiculous to require us to work in accordance with human rights law. That's China there. And that's Damon. You can't really see him arguing against China. The resolution passed in a watered-down form. It was actually quite significant, even though the language itself was weakened. When we go to the language of the convention itself, I think we can see where some of this disconnect continues even within the legal instruments. This is from the preamble to the 1961 convention. And we see that the primary objective of the treaty supposedly is to be concerned with the health and welfare of mankind, and talks about the need to provide narcotic drugs for pain relief and for scientific and medical purposes. And for those of us who do human rights, I think we can be very comfortable with this kind of language. This is very much falls within the conception of the right to the highest attainable standard of health. The general comment on Article 12 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights talks specifically about one of the obligations within Article 12, the right to health, is the provision of medicines, for example. So I think for human rights people like ourselves, this is something we can be very comfortable with, this kind of conception of drug control. But of course, this more humanitarian instinct is sort of immediately undercut by the subsequent lines in the preamble, which talks about addiction to narcotic drugs constituting a serious evil for the individual and being fraught with significant danger to mankind, and it's the responsibility of states to combat this evil. And I remember when I was doing research on this, I was really perplexed because the term evil isn't something you really see in legal instruments. You know, we talk about evil, that's like a philosophical concept or a theological concept that we talk about. You don't really talk about evil within legal terms. So it got me thinking about other international instruments that were drafted to control or suppress or prohibit other kinds of behaviors or social institutions or social or political systems which the international community finds abhorrent. So, for example, the Convention Against Slavery in 1926 doesn't describe slavery as evil. The Genocide Convention doesn't describe genocide as evil. The Non-Proliferation Treaty doesn't describe nuclear holocaust as evil. The Apartheid Convention doesn't describe apartheid as evil, and the Torture Convention doesn't describe torture as evil. Yet somehow drug addiction within international law is evil, an evil that must be combated through universal coordinated action amongst states. The language, as we get past 1961, gets even a bit more, dramatic. This is from the Political Declaration on Drugs in 1988. Drugs are a grave threat to the health and well-being of all mankind, the independence of states, democracy, the stability of nations, the structure of all societies, and the dignity and hope of millions of people and their families. And this is very much the kind of language you see today in instruments around terrorism. And I think there is a parallel when we're talking about human rights protections in one war, the war on drugs versus the war on terror. I think there's a lot of work that is available to be done by people doing human rights to look at some of the parallels in the approach to those. And I guess just to close off then, we have to start thinking in human rights terms is what are actually the human rights consequences of defining drugs and drug addiction as an evil that needs to be combated through coordinated universal action. And just to touch on a few very quickly, there's many. The death penalty is one that we've already mentioned earlier on. I say Ricky would know this sign much better than us. The death penalty for drug offenses. I say the issue that the International Narcotics Control Board doesn't have an opinion on. Well, the UN human rights system has very strong opinions on this. The Human Rights Committee has said explicitly that drug crimes do not meet the threshold of most serious crimes under Article 6.2 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime has, in this point in time, spoken out against the death penalty for drugs, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Quite unanimous opinion amongst the United Nations generally on the death penalty and specifically the death penalty for drugs. Despite that, about 32 countries and territories have the death penalty for drugs in legislation, and we estimate that perhaps up to 1,000 people a year are executed for drug offenses. So it's actually, in terms of overall executions internationally, drug offenses represent a significant number of people who are executed. Arbitrary detention, the other issue I mentioned at the beginning. In quite a number of countries, particularly in Asia and South Asia, we have forms of arbitrary detention, detention without trial, administrative detention, under the guise of drug treatment. And these are, people can be detained for months or even up to years at a time in conditions which have been very well documented now in many countries, amount to forced labor, if not inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment, beatings, overcrowded prison conditions, lack of access to medical treatment, humiliating treatment, caning. About 350,000 people in arbitrary detention of this kind in China, in drug detention, say Vietnam, Thailand, India, Russia, some other countries. Ironically, the very week that Hamid Godzi said that the International Narcotics Control Board didn't have a position on this, 12 UN agencies came out collectively with a statement condemning drug detention, sort of a fairly unprecedented statement by 12 separate agencies of the UN, yet the International Narcotics Control Board doesn't have an opinion. Again, related not only to drug detention centers, but something our colleague Eka Yakobashvili, alumni here of the Essex Human Rights Center, has done sort of the leading work on, is the issue of corporal punishment for drug offenses, which we see in at least a dozen countries that we've documented it in: caning, flogging, whipping for drug use or relapsing from drug addiction or from drug treatment. Again, very clearly a form of inhuman and degrading punishment, which is fairly universally condemned by human rights monitors. And just very quickly, again, it's already been mentioned, the right to health. We have about 15 million people that we know inject drugs worldwide, a very major behavior in the spread of HIV epidemics in many parts of the world. Yet in many parts of the world, people are denied the access to the prevention of, or access to measures to prevent HIV, such as sterile injecting equipment, such as methadone programs. Very much putting those people at additional and preventable risk of HIV infection and increased overdose in many countries as well. That's something we can talk about more specifically, and something that Professor Hunt did quite a lot of work on during his time as special rapporteur. And so I opened with two people, one you recognize and one you didn't, probably the same here. You probably, although reversed, you probably recognize the person on your left, the Pope. The person on your right you probably don't recognize. That's Yuri Fedotov, the newish head of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, a career Russian diplomat, former Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom, who is unfortunately bringing a very reactionary tenor to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime at the moment, particularly when it comes to rights of health issues of people who use drugs. Also when it comes to issues that Noam mentioned of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime's position on Afghanistan. Of course, Russia is very much fighting with Afghanistan in the international arena because Russia blames its drug problems on Afghanistan. And just a nice quote from Tvetan Todorov, the philosopher, talking about the context of delivering us from evil. The idea that it implies that there is an evil element in human nature from which God can free us, and we'll pray that he'll free us as beings. And we know human beings have sometimes been tempted to take upon this purifying role ourselves, and we're very well aware of the catastrophic consequences. So thank you very much.
Of the International Centre on Human Rights and Drug Policy, also Deputy Director at Harm Reduction International. He's very well known internationally for his work on the human rights dimensions of drug policies as researcher, advocate, thinker. And he's the author of the first commentary on Article 33 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the only core UN human rights treaty to refer to drugs, and this is going to be the subject of his talk. Thanks very much, Damon.
Sorry. Thanks very much, Paul. I promised this wasn't planned, but I'm pretty much going to follow almost exactly Rick's trajectory in his talk, and I'm going to drill it down into the rights of the child. If possible, except without evil, I'm talking about something a little bit more positive. I'm asking the question about appropriate measures for quite a good reason, and I think you'll see it. We've been doing seminars, myself and Rick, at universities for the last few years as part of this project. And the first one we did was in Galway at the Irish Centre for Human Rights. And myself and Rick were sitting in a hotel, and we wondered how we were going to do it. And we realized the best way to do it is just ask the audience to name any human right, any single human right you like, and we'll be able to connect it to drug policy pretty quickly. One particular smart arse said, well, the right to not be imprisoned for non-payment of a debt. And I was like, that's just not fair. You can't prove us wrong. But what I can do, what it showed was two things. The first is that drug policy is sweeping, but the second is that the human rights framework is more than up to the challenge. Now the thing is, over time I've realized that you can name any child right, and I can connect it to drug policy in the same way. Now part of that is because the Convention on the Rights of the Child is quite comprehensive, and the other is because the impacts of drug control and drug policies and drug use and dependence on children is so sweeping. And I'm going to try and deal with some of that now. So this picture follows a raid on a favela in Brazil in 2009. I think it was on a day when 19 people were killed. And the first time I looked at it, the reason I looked at it was about where your eye is drawn. And it's drawn to the bloody mess to the center left. What you miss is the blurry child in the foreground, I think, often, which is looking directly at you, almost asking to be noticed. And I found that across the board, really, in drug control and in children's rights, the issue of children and drugs coming together hasn't necessarily been noticed. You got the Declaration on the Rights of the Child in 1959, talking about mankind owing to the child the best it has to give. And in drug control, similar rhetoric comes through. What you often find is that, and this happens at the UN level, you've got the Political Declaration on Drugs there from 2009. That was the 10-year review, by the way, of the declaration Rick mentioned, talking about children as our future and youth as our most precious asset. Therefore, what we do is in their name, as well as democracies and the well-being of our entire society and all the rest of the stuff that Rick mentioned. You see this at national level too, and you see it to justify some pretty unusual things. I might talk about that a little later, but children are at the foreground of justifications for drug control. And I think that's right. I can't think of a better justification. But the question is whether what's actually been done delivers on that promise or not, or if it's been positive or negative for children's rights and well-being. coming in the middle of those two declarations that I mentioned, of course, is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In fact, smack in the middle was the first time drugs appeared in the negotiations, and it was introduced by China. It looks very different now. This is the actual wording from what it did then. At the time, it was about preventing and prohibiting children from using drugs, but the Netherlands quite, I think, helpfully pointed out that this is a children's rights convention, and talking about prevention, preventing things or prohibitions within it, it doesn't fit. So a more of a protection approach was taken. It's a 50-word article, right? So and it's, read on its own, if you take a rather literal approach to that, it's not going to tell you much at all. It simply says that you take all appropriate measures to protect children from drugs and don't let them get used in the drug trade either, which is singularly unhelpful, in fact, except that it brings those parallel universes we talked about straight together, at least for children and young people within this convention. So the question of what it means, I think, is quite important, because children's rights have not really been much of a subject in drugs when it comes to drug policies. Article 33 in the academia, if you search for it, doesn't really appear, and if it does, my name's probably now next to it, sadly. And there's a couple of notable articles, but not many. In the UN drug control regime, it pops up every so often, but it's rare and it's usually unhelpful. It will either be equating it with prevention, so education in schools and just stopping children using drugs, which is part of it but not the entirety. It doesn't lead you anywhere. There are resolutions at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs on Children, and they will frame everything around Article 33, but then they just talk about what we call primary prevention. And at the Committee on the Rights of the Child, you've got some very helpful recommendations. You've got general comment on HIV/AIDS, which has some very good normative guidance in it. You've got the general comment on adolescent health, which is good. You've got some concluding observations that are excellent, particularly in more recent years. I would invite anybody to read the one on Ukraine from 2011. Then you've got some that are very general and quite vague. They just restate Article 33 and move on. And then you've got some that are really quite unhelpful. They tend to talk about combating drug addiction the same way as the Drug Convention does. And a particular example where, at the time, I think it was 2002, the Philippines were asked to enforce their drug control legislation in order to protect children, which was a real example of the committee's ignorance of the context, because at the time the Philippines had the death penalty for drugs. They've now abolished it for all crimes, but at the time that's what the Committee on the Rights of the Child was telling the Philippines to do in the name of children's rights. In the actual conventions themselves, I think this is an example of the parallel universes too, and the reason to drill down. You've got these singular mentions. Drugs appears once in the core human rights treaties, happens to be the CRC. It does appear in the International Labour Organization Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labour, pops up in the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, a kind of mixed up wording of Article 33 that makes it considerably worse, I think. And it comes up in some other regional documents. Human rights appears only once in those 3 drug conventions that Rick mentioned, which is unusual given that there's over 110 articles collectively. Given that they cover issues like extradition and penalties, it appears only once, and it's in the context of crop eradication in the 1988 Trafficking Convention. And then the interesting thing for me is I did a search for children and minors and youth and any such wording, and they similarly appear only once each. Children appears in the preamble to the 1988 convention, in that the threat to children is a danger of, quote, incalculable gravity. And minors appear also in the same convention under the penal provisions, saying that if you use minors in trafficking or if you sell drugs near a sports or educational ground, these are the particularly serious crimes. So there's the official connections drawn. Of course, that doesn't mean that there are more connections, but it needs a lot more work that hasn't quite been done, which is what this book was about. I believe, yeah, there we go. So, I did this with my colleague, Philip Veerman, who's now a psychologist working with young people who use drugs in the Netherlands, but he formerly was at Defence for Children International, so he's got a good crossover there. And that Nancy has a copy of this book if anyone wants to read it. To buy it yourself, it's quite expensive. But there is one here in Nancy's office if anyone